Welcome back to the channel, where we explore history in a way that makes you feel as if you are truly living it. Tonight, let us step into a place you might think you know well, the medieval castle. In movies and games, castles are shown as cozy strongholds with roaring fires, velvet drapes, and banquets filled with warmth. But the reality of life within those stone walls, especially during the winter nights, was far less glamorous. Imagine arriving at a castle in January, the wind cutting across the battlements, the torches flickering in the snow-filled air. You expect that once you cross the heavy wooden doors you will find relief, but the truth strikes almost immediately. Castles were not havens of comfort. They were freezing chambers of survival. The very stone that made castles invincible against armies also made them relentless enemies of warmth. Stone absorbs heat and releases it slowly, but in the wrong way for human comfort. Instead of keeping a steady temperature, it sucked up the day's limited heat and then radiated back the night's bitter cold. Those thick walls that appear majestic in photos were, in daily life, like ice blocks that seem to pull warmth from your very bones. Once darkness fell, the interiors were often almost as cold as the world outside. Sometimes even colder because of dampness seeping through the stone. Step into a chamber at midnight, and you would find a space that was vast, drafty, and hostile. High ceilings swallowed any heat that might rise from the hearth. Windows, if they existed at all, were rarely made of glass. Only the richest lords could afford a few glazed panes. Most were simple wooden shutters, or else covered with oiled cloth or slices of animal horn, all of which let in drafts. Even with the shutters closed, narrow cracks allowed icy air to whistle through. Doors were no better. They were designed for function, not insulation. And every corridor, every stairwell, every gap became a channel for cold air to travel through the castle like an invisible invader. Many accounts from the period confirm this chilling reality. One 15th century chronicle notes that wash basins left in noble chambers froze solid overnight, making morning ablutions a painful experience. A letter from a French household complains that frost formed inside the curtains of the bed itself, leaving the sleeper wrapped in ice crystals. A monk once described his stone cell as fit for storing fish rather than housing men, because of the damp cold that never lifted, even in summer. These were not exaggerations. For countless people, from lords in towers to servants in side rooms, the castle was a home where the battle against cold was constant and rarely won. What did this mean for the people who lived there physically? It was a struggle. The body shivers to generate heat, but night after night of shivering wears down energy. Sleep becomes fragmented, and exhaustion builds. Illness thrived in these conditions, because cold, damp environments aggravated respiratory problems and joint pains. Psychologically, the cold created its own weight. Imagine lying in bed and feeling the chill creep into your muscles, hearing the wind moan through arrow slits, and knowing there was no switch to flip, no heater to hum to life. The only choice was to endure. The design of castles, meant for defense, made this situation worse. Rooms were intentionally large to display power and to hold many people during feasts or gatherings. But once the fire died down and the guests dispersed, those rooms turned into caverns of cold air. Heat rose to the rafters and was lost. Even standing near a hearth provided only limited comfort. Step just a few paces away, and the air turned biting again. Servants who worked in these chambers often reported numb fingers, stiff joints, and fatigue from constant cold exposure. One of the most vivid ways to understand this is to compare it with smaller peasant homes of the same era. While peasants lived in smoky, cramped huts, their small spaces were easier to keep warm. The hearth in a single-room cottage could at least heat the entire area, even if the air was thick with smoke. In contrast, a nobleman's bedchamber might be large enough to hold dozens of people, yet nearly impossible to heat with a single fireplace. Ironically, the poorest sometimes slept warmer than the richest, though their surroundings were rougher. Travelers also left accounts of the cold within castles. Pilgrims passing through northern Europe often described inns and guest chambers as so cold that it was preferable to sleep near livestock in a barn. Some even admitted they dreaded noble hospitality in winter, because although the food might be plentiful, the sleeping arrangements left them stiff and aching with frost by morning. A Spanish envoy in England once wrote that he envied peasants huddled in their cottages, while he and his fellow dignitaries shivered inside grand but freezing stone halls. It is important to remember that medieval people did not simply accept this passively. They fought back in creative ways, using textiles, layering, and rituals that we will explore in later parts of this story. But here, at the foundation, the fact remains clear. The medieval castle, for all its splendor, was an icebox at night. The cold seeped into walls, floors, and minds. To live inside was to be constantly aware of it, constantly shaped by it, constantly trying to survive it. So the next time you see a glamorous movie set with glowing fireplaces and nobles reclining in luxury, remember that the reality was far less forgiving. The castle was a fortress of stone, yes, but also a fortress of cold. The people who lived within it endured nights of shivering, mornings of frozen water, and days of battling drafts that came through every opening. It was not just a place of grandeur and power, it was also a place of constant discomfort, and understanding that truth is the first step to understanding the lives of the people who inhabited those legendary walls. When night fell inside a medieval castle, there was one place that seemed to promise some measure of comfort: the Great Hall. If the private chambers upstairs were icy vaults of stone, the Great Hall was the beating heart of warmth, light, and life. It was where the Lord and his household gathered, where feasts were held, where guests were welcomed, and where, for a few precious hours, the battle against the cold was suspended. Imagine stepping into this vast chamber after wandering through dark, drafty corridors. Your fingers are numb, your breath comes out in misty clouds, and then suddenly you are greeted by the glow of firelight. At the center of the hall, a great hearth roars with logs so large they resemble fallen tree trunks. Sparks leap upward into a canopy of smoke, and the air closest to the flames feels almost too hot compared to the chill outside. This was more than just a space for eating. The great hall served as a communal heater for the entire castle. The combination of roaring fire and gathered bodies made it one of the few places where warmth was even possible. Servants hustled in and out carrying platters of food, nobles reclined on benches covered with furs, and musicians or storytellers entertained by the firelight. But behind all the ceremony and ritual, there was a simple human truth. People gathered in the hall because it was the only spot where you could escape the icy grip of the rest of the castle. In many ways, the medieval feast was not just about food or celebration. It was about survival. Historical records show that the temperature in a hall filled with hundreds of guests could rise several degrees simply from body heat. Imagine 200 people packed shoulder to shoulder, laughing, singing, eating, all exhaling warmth into the air. For a short while, the space became bearable. Chroniclers even mention winter banquets, where the heat inside was so intense that people shed layers of clothing, only to put them back on the moment they left the room. A feast was, in part, a temporary miracle of physics. People themselves became radiators. Yet even this oasis of warmth had sharp limits. If you stood directly in front of the hearth, your face and hands burned with heat, but your back remained chilled. A few steps farther away, and the cold reclaimed its territory. Stone walls exhaled frost, drafts whistled through gaps in shutters, and smoke drifted down to sting the eyes. The fire was powerful, but it was never enough to conquer the entire hall. Comfort depended on proximity. Nobles claimed the best seats near the blaze. Servants and lesser guests were left on the edges, where shivering was unavoidable. This spatial hierarchy reflected the social hierarchy. Closeness to heat meant closeness to power. Still, the warmth of the hall was precious. Many people delayed, returning to their chambers until the very last moment, lingering by the hearth as long as they could. Some chose to sleep on benches or floors near the fire, rather than brave the frozen staircases that led to their private rooms. Travelers often recorded this choice in their journals, admitting that the smell of smoke, the noise of servants, and even the risk of theft were preferable to shivering in a solitary chamber. For peasants visiting a castle, a place near the great hall fire was considered a luxury in itself. The hall was not just physical refuge, there was psychological comfort too. Firelight created a sense of safety and community. The flicker of flames, the murmur of voices, the scent of roasted meat, all of it worked together to push back the darkness and fear that accompanied medieval nights. When the wind howled outside and wolves cried in the distance, the warmth of the hall reminded people that they were not alone. In an age without electricity, without central heating, without even reliable candles for most households, the great hall was as close to a sanctuary as one could get. There are stories of winter feasts that highlight this dual role of the hall as both social stage and thermal lifeline. In a 14th century English manor, it was noted that servants were instructed to sit close together during the coldest nights to sustain the warmth of the hall. That small detail reveals the reality. Even celebration was shaped by the need to conserve heat. What looked like tradition or ritual was, at its core, a practical solution to a hostile environment. For nobles, hosting winter feasts was also a statement of wealth and generosity. Fuel was expensive. Firewood had to be gathered, dried, and transported, sometimes from miles away. To keep a massive hearth blazing for hours required resources that not every household could spare. So when a lord invited dozens or even hundreds of guests to dine in the great hall during winter, it was not only a gesture of hospitality but also proof of power. It showed that he could command enough wood and labor to keep the fire roaring, while others outside struggled to keep even a small hearth burning. Warmth was political currency. Of course, the illusion of comfort could not last forever. Eventually, the feasting ended, the musicians fell silent, and the guests began to drift back toward their quarters. The fire burned lower, and the hall slowly surrendered to the cold once more. Servants dozed by the dying embers, occasionally stirring the logs to keep a faint glow alive. But for most of the household, the return to freezing chambers was inevitable. The warm island had vanished, and the sea of cold reclaimed its hold. And yet, for those few hours, the great hall was a beacon. It offered relief, connection, and the fleeting joy of warmth. It was here that people laughed, shared stories, sang songs, and forgot, for a little while, the hardships of the season. In the larger story of medieval life, the Great Hall symbolizes a truth we can still understand today, that when the world outside feels cold and hostile, gathering together by the fire, sharing food and company, is one of the most powerful forms of survival we have. When you imagine a medieval castle bedroom, it is tempting to picture a vast, ornate chamber dominated by a heavy wooden bed, carved with intricate details. At first glance, it looks like luxury grand posts rising upward, curtains embroidered with rich fabrics, thick blankets folded neatly. But if you strip away the romance, the truth becomes clear. This bed was not just a piece of furniture, it was a survival machine. Every element of it was designed not for beauty but for defense against the cold. To sleep in a medieval castle was to enter a battle against frost, and the bed was your fortress. The bed stood high above the floor, and this was not only for prestige. Cold air always sinks, so by raising the frame several feet, sleepers escaped the chilliest layers that pooled at ground level. Beneath the canopy, curtains fell on every side, creating a small chamber within the chamber. Once closed, these curtains trapped the body heat of the sleepers, the warmth of blankets, and even the faint heat from a nearby fire. A well-arranged bed could feel like a tent inside a cave, a tiny pocket of survivable climate carved out of stone and ice. Layers were the heart of this design. Linen sheets formed the base, smoother against the skin than rough wool. Above that came blankets, heavy and scratchy, pressing the sleeper into place. Then furs were piled on top fox, sable, bear, or sheep, depending on what the household could afford. Wealthier nobles sometimes layered so many covers that it was said a person could barely move beneath them. Servants joked that their masters looked like cocooned caterpillars, pinned down until morning. The heaviness of these coverings was not accidental. It was strategy. The sheer weight helped trap every ounce of warmth. Fur deserves special mention. Beyond being a mark of status, it was one of the most effective insulators available. A noble might treasure fur-lined quilts more than jewelry, because on a winter night those pelts could mean the difference between misery and tolerable sleep. Inventories from noble households list furs with obsessive detail, showing how central they were to daily survival. To the medieval mind, investing in bedding was not vanity, it was life insurance. The curtains of the bed worked their own kind of magic. Thick tapestries or oiled cloth lined the inside, muting drafts that whistled through arrow slits and shutters. They muffled sound as well, offering an illusion of privacy in echoing stone halls. Some curtains were even waxed to make them heavier and more resistant to moisture. When you pulled them shut at night, the effect was immediate. The air inside the bed became warmer, stiller, and quieter, even if only by a few degrees. Those few degrees could mean survival. People believed so strongly in the protective power of these beds that nobles sometimes traveled with dismantled bed frames, transporting them on carts from one residence to another. Imagine the trouble of hauling such a massive object just to ensure you had the right cocoon waiting at night. That effort alone shows how critical the bed was. The mattress underneath played a decisive role too. For nobles, the feather bed was the ultimate comfort, stuffed with goose or duck down, soft, pliable, and capable of holding warmth. Lying on one was like being embraced by a cloud. But feather beds could be tricky. They sometimes trapped too much heat, leaving sleepers sweaty even in cold months, or they collapsed into hollows that forced people into uncomfortable positions. For most, though, the alternative was far less appealing. The straw tick, this was simply a sack stuffed with straw or reeds, lumpy, scratchy, and quick to flatten. Fleas thrived in it, and the smell of damp hay lingered constantly. Yet even this crude solution raised the body above the freezing floor, providing just enough insulation to matter. Servants and peasants often relied on such beds, while nobles guarded their feather mattresses as family heirlooms. To climb into one of these fortress beds was to enter a carefully engineered ritual. First, you wrapped yourself in a nightshirt, sometimes with extra wool layers or even a cap to protect your head. Then you slid between linen sheets, pulled heavy blankets up, adjusted furs, and finally drew the curtains closed. Inside, your breath fogged more slowly, your body heat collected, and the world outside seemed to recede. Even if frost formed on the chamber walls, even if drafts hissed under the door, you had created a tiny sphere where sleep was possible. Yet this cocoon was fragile. Curtains froze stiff with condensation. Blankets grew damp from constant contact with moisture in the air. Straw mattresses had to be beaten and fluffed daily to chase out vermin. Dogs sometimes climbed into the bed for extra warmth, shedding fur and bringing dirt with them. Nothing was perfect. But each detail, the linens, the furs, the curtains, the height of the frame, represented a layer of defense in a nightly war against cold. To a modern eye, these might look like symbols of nobility. To medieval sleepers, they were shields. What is striking is how universal this pattern was. Whether in castles or humbler homes, the principle was the same. Build a microclimate where the body could endure. Peasants might not have carved oak beds or velvet curtains, but they piled straw thickly, huddled together with family, and pulled patched wool blankets tight. Nobles had more resources, but the struggle was identical. Everyone faced the same cold stone, the same drafts, the same long nights of winter. The bed was, in many ways, a metaphor for medieval life itself. It looked grand from a distance, but close up it revealed the constant negotiation between hardship and ingenuity. People did not expect comfort in the modern sense. They expected survival, and survival was enough. To lie under furs, to feel the curtains block the draft, to wake with all 10 fingers and toes intact. These were victories. Every night was a campaign, every morning a quiet triumph. As you picture this now, you realize how clever, resilient, and resourceful people had to be. With no central heating, no double glazing, no modern insulation, they turned wood, cloth, feathers, and fur into tools of endurance. Their beds were not just symbols of wealth or decoration. They were microclimates, handcrafted zones of warmth inside hostile fortresses of stone. And in those fragile cocoons, humanity endured, dreamt, and prepared for another day. If the bed was the private fortress against the cold, then the fireplace was the public weapon. When we think of medieval castles, we often imagine roaring fires blazing in giant hearths, smoke curling upward, and people gathered in a cozy glow, but the truth is far less romantic. Fireplaces were essential, yes, but they were also deeply flawed. They offered moments of comfort while reminding everyone of their limitations. In fact, the medieval fireplace was both a symbol of warmth and a constant reminder of how difficult warmth truly was to achieve. The earliest castles did not even have proper fireplaces. Instead, they relied on open hearths, often placed in the center of a great hall. The fire burned directly on the floor, with smoke rising to escape through a hole in the roof. It warmed the immediate area, but the effect was uneven and messy. Those sitting close to the flames roasted on one side while their backs froze. Those sitting farther away might feel little warmth at all, only smoke that irritated their eyes and clung to their clothing. The roof beams grew black with soot, and sparks sometimes leapt dangerously onto rushes that covered the floor. Fire was life, but it was also hazard. Over time, the fireplace evolved. Builders carved chimneys into walls, creating stone hearths with hoods to direct smoke upward. This was an improvement, Rooms were less smoky, and fires could be built against walls rather than in the middle of the floor. But still, the fireplace was incredibly inefficient. Most of the heat shot straight up the chimney and vanished into the sky. Less than a quarter of the fire's energy stayed in the room. To keep a chamber even mildly warm, enormous amounts of wood were required, often carted in by the ton. A single castle could devour entire forests across a winter season. Even so, the warmth remained local, almost selfish. If you sat in front of a hearth, you could toast your hands and feel your cheeks glow, but take just a few steps back, and the cold crept in again. The stone walls absorbed every drop of warmth. The drafts reasserted themselves, and you were reminded that a fire could not conquer an entire chamber. For this reason, nobles fought for the best seats closest to the flames. Position at table was not just about honor, it was about heat. Servants and lesser guests sat at the far ends, where breath still turned to mist, even during feasts. Another challenge was smoke. Chimneys were primitive and often drew poorly. On windy nights, smoke could blow back into the room, filling the chamber with a choking haze. Eyes watered, lungs ached, and people coughed their way through dinners. The smell lingered in clothes, tapestries, and hair. Some halls became so smoke-filled that chroniclers compared them to caves. People accepted this as part of life. Warmth always came with a price. Beyond fireplaces, smaller devices were used to bring warmth to the bed itself. One of the most common was the bed warming pan, a metal container filled with glowing embers, placed between the sheets before sleep. It worked, but it was dangerous. If left too long, it could scorch the linens or even set the bed ablaze. More than one household recorded tragedies where fire meant to save comfort destroyed entire rooms. Yet people continued to use them because the alternative, sliding into icy sheets, was unbearable. There were also portable braziers, essentially bowls of burning coals carried from room to room. Servants would move them ahead of their masters, trying to make a chamber tolerable before the lord arrived. But these too carried risks. Coals spilled, sparks flew, and smoke filled enclosed spaces. The air often became so thick that windows had to be cracked open, which only let the cold sweep back inside. Heating was always a compromise, a constant negotiation between safety, resource, and necessity. What makes this struggle even more striking is the sheer cost of fuel. Firewood was not infinite, and in many regions it was scarce. Nobles controlled forests carefully, rationing timber for construction, charcoal, and fires. Ordinary villagers often had strict limits on how much wood they could gather. In places where wood ran low, people turned to peat or dried animal dung as substitutes. The smoke from these was foul and clinging, but when survival was at stake, people burned whatever they could. The very air inside a castle told you something about the land's resources. Sweet-smelling oak meant wealth. Acrid peat meant necessity. Even with all these efforts, rooms were rarely warm by our standards. At best, the space directly around a fire felt cozy. Beyond that small radius, drafts and chill reigned supreme. Imagine trying to write, read, or sew in such conditions. Hands stiffened, ink froze, breath clouded the parchment. Servants carried hot stones wrapped in cloth to slip into their sleeves, trying to keep fingers supple enough to work. Women, sewing or spinning, drew their stools close to the fire until their skirts nearly touched the embers. Children clung to animals for extra heat. Fire was always there, but it was never enough. The psychological effect of fireplaces should not be underestimated. The glow of flames gave people comfort, even when the heat itself did not reach them. To see fire in the dark was to feel a sense of control over the elements. The flicker on stone walls, the crackle of burning wood, the scent of smoke. These sensations reassured people that life persisted in the heart of winter. It was as much about morale as temperature. People huddled by the hearth not only for warmth, but also for companionship, storytelling, and reassurance that they were not alone in the cold. And yet, despite all these efforts, fireplaces never conquered the fundamental reality of medieval castles. They were patches of warmth in oceans of ice, islands in a sea of chill stone. They provided relief, but never complete protection. To live in a castle was to live with constant cold, even if a fire blazed nearby. It is telling that when central heating was finally invented centuries later, it was seen not as a luxury, but as a revolution. For medieval people, fire was both gift and curse, life-saving, but always inadequate. So the next time you picture a medieval hearth blazing with comfort, remember the truth. Yes, it offered warmth, but only for those closest to it. Yes, it provided light and life, but it also filled rooms with smoke and consumed forests of wood. It was precious, dangerous, unreliable, and absolutely essential. Fire was survival, but never victory. In a medieval castle, sleep was rarely a solitary act. Today we take privacy for granted, shutting a bedroom door and retreating into our own carefully heated space. But in the Middle Ages, privacy was a luxury few could afford, and warmth was a resource too precious to waste. That is why communal sleeping was not only common, but often essential. To share a bed or a chamber was less about intimacy and more about survival. Imagine entering a lord's household as the night drew in. The great hall fire had burned low, and the household dispersed to find their places for the night. Servants carried torches into chambers, guiding people to their allotted spaces. In one room, you might find a group of squires rolling out bedding side by side on the floor. In another, ladies-in-waiting huddled together beneath heavy blankets, whispering gossip until sleep claimed them. Even nobles, who owned the grand four-poster beds, often shared them with family members, trusted companions, or honored guests. Beds large enough for 2 or 3 adults were not uncommon, and sharing warmth was seen as both practical and natural. For children, sleeping together was almost automatic. Brothers and sisters curled into a single straw mattress, often with a pet dog or cat tucked between them. The animal's body heat was as valuable as a blanket. In winter, livestock might even be brought into lower chambers or nearby barns, and the warmth of their breath seeped upward through floorboards. Farmers and peasants did this as well, sometimes sleeping in the same space as pigs or cows. To us it may sound unpleasant, but to them it was life-saving. The combined heat of bodies, human and animal alike, was often the difference between frostbite and rest. Even monasteries followed this pattern. Monks lived by strict rules of silence and prayer, but they still slept in shared dormitories, rows of pallets lined up against stone walls. The rationale was partly spiritual discipline, but also pragmatic. Many bodies in one room meant more warmth in a building that was otherwise nearly impossible to heat. Cloisters might echo with coughing, snoring, and rustling, but that was part of the rhythm of communal life. Sleep was not about comfort. It was about endurance together. There was also a cultural dimension to this practice. To share a bed was not automatically seen as scandalous or inappropriate, the way modern eyes might assume. Travelers often recorded being placed in a bed with strangers at inns or castles, and while it could be awkward, it was expected. A noble visiting another household might be invited to share the Lord's own bed as a gesture of honor. The warmth of sleeping close was not always interpreted as romantic or suspicious. It was simply the most efficient way to survive the night. The layering of bodies created its own strange etiquette. Those in the middle of a shared bed might overheat, while those on the outside shivered. People had to negotiate positions, turning together when blankets shifted. Servants who slept on rushes laid across the floor often pressed close to one another like sardines, grateful for any extra body heat. In castles during winter, the smell of damp wool, sweat, and smoke mingled in the air, but complaints were rare. Comfort was measured in degrees of warmth, not in luxury. Communal sleeping also served a social function. It reinforced bonds among household members, encouraged storytelling, and allowed people to pass long winter nights in company. Before drifting off, groups would share prayers, folk tales, or whispered news. Children learned family legends from grandparents while lying shoulder to shoulder. Young squires shared dreams of knighthood with one another in hushed voices under blankets. Even the act of listening to another person's breathing offered reassurance. In a world where disease, famine, and violence were constant threats, the simple knowledge that someone lay beside you made the night less frightening. Of course, there were downsides. Lice and fleas spread quickly in shared beds. Illness passed from person to person with ease, and epidemics sometimes swept through entire households. Chroniclers mention winters where whole families lay feverish in the same bed, unable to escape contagion. Privacy was non-existent, and for nobles this could become awkward. A bed shared with attendants meant no secrets, no hidden tears, no solitary peace. Every cough, every restless movement, every nightmare was witnessed. Yet people accepted these conditions as normal. Solitude, for most, would have been a colder and lonelier fate. Communal sleeping was also part of hospitality. When guests arrived, they were folded into the household, not just at the table but in the bedchamber. To be offered a place in a bed was a mark of trust. Refusing such an offer could even be considered rude, as if you doubted the host's honor. Travelers often recounted strange bedfellows encountered on journeys, a merchant sharing with a monk, a soldier with a lawyer, a noblewoman with her maid. These arrangements blurred social lines, but also reflected the shared vulnerability of cold nights. When the temperature dropped, hierarchies softened, if only until morning. The image of communal sleep reveals something essential about medieval society. People survived together. Castles may look imposing and solitary from the outside, but inside, warmth depended on human closeness. Fireplaces could not heat vast halls. Furs could only go so far, but the shared warmth of bodies created resilience. To climb into bed with family, friends, or even strangers was not shameful. It was survival written into nightly routine. In the end, communal sleeping was both practical necessity and cultural habit. It protected people from the brutal cold of stone fortresses, strengthened social bonds, and reminded everyone that in the darkness of a medieval night, survival was never an individual achievement. It was a collective act, repeated night after night, under shared blankets, within the echoing walls of castles that were magnificent to look at, but unforgiving to live in. If you lived in a medieval castle, you would soon learn that your greatest enemy at night was not always the freezing air itself, but the drafts that crept through every crack, slit, and seam of the building. Cold did not simply seep into a chamber. It attacked in gusts, sneaking under doors, sliding through shutters, and whistling down corridors like an invisible thief. People of the Middle Ages knew this well, and they developed a wide array of methods, both practical and inventive, to fight against these drafts and insulate their living spaces. Their solutions were not perfect, but they reveal how people adapted to the stubborn realities of stone and wind. The first line of defense was at the windows. Glass was rare and fantastically expensive, so most castle windows were open slits for archery and light. In winter, these were closed with wooden shutters, but shutters alone could not keep the cold out. People experimented with translucent materials that allowed in some daylight while blocking wind, slices of polished horn, sheets of oiled parchment, or cloth soaked in wax. Each of these dimmed the light, but the trade-off was worth it. Better to live in twilight than to let icy air sweep across your bedchamber all night. Still, shutters rattled and leaked. The wind whistled through gaps, sometimes with such force that tapestries hung on walls billowed inward. So households used fabric as insulation. Heavy curtains were hung not just around beds, but across windows, across doors, even across sections of entire rooms. Thick wool or velvet drapes transformed a hall into smaller, warmer pockets of space. Tapestries, often celebrated for their beauty, were practical first and decorative second. A massive weaving covering a wall did not just tell stories of hunts or battles. It sealed cracks and created a barrier against the stone's cold breath. The richer the household, the more cloth they could spare for this task. In poorer settings, rush mats or patched quilts were pressed into service. Doors were another weak point. The huge wooden gates of a castle were impossible to insulate completely, but within the private chambers smaller doors could be managed. Woolen hangings were draped over thresholds, and gaps at the bottom were stuffed with straw, moss, or scraps of cloth. Servants learned to roll straw into long bundles, to jam under door frames, acting as primitive draft stoppers. The sound of straw crackling underfoot as someone shifted the barrier was a familiar nighttime noise. Floors, too, demanded attention. Bare stone was a merciless conductor of cold, so households strew rushes or reeds across chamber floors. These were not only for cleanliness, they also provided a thin layer of insulation. In wealthier homes, woven carpets from the East became prized possessions. A Persian carpet was not just exotic art. It was warmth underfoot. In less wealthy halls, layers of rushes were scattered thickly, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender to mask the smell as they decayed. While hardly luxurious by modern standards, they softened the chill that radiated upward from stone. People even turned to architecture itself as insulation. Some castles were built with interior wooden paneling against stone walls, creating a small pocket of air between the two surfaces. These panels, often carved and decorated, gave the illusion of elegance, while quietly serving as insulation. In chambers without paneling, wall hangings did the same work. A noble's bedroom, lined with woolen cloth or tapestry, could be several degrees warmer than the bare rooms below where servants slept. Another clever tactic was seasonal adaptation. Families rotated the use of rooms depending on the time of year. In summer, they lived in lofty chambers with large windows and high ceilings that allowed air to circulate. But in winter, they retreated to smaller, more easily heated rooms on lower floors. These chambers might be tucked behind kitchens or near storage areas where warmth from fires seeped through walls. Bedrooms became less about grandeur and more about practicality. Nobles sacrificed prestige for survival, clustering in spaces that were easier to shield from drafts. Insulation extended to clothing and bedding as well. Nightwear included long woolen tunics, caps to cover the head, and sometimes even gloves. People treated their own bodies like another layer of insulation. wrapping themselves in layer after layer before lying down. The bed curtains, the furs, the feather mattresses all were part of this insulating system, a carefully arranged fortress within the larger fortress of the castle. Despite all these efforts, drafts were never truly defeated. They crept in relentlessly, carrying with them the dampness of northern winters. Chroniclers wrote of tapestries moving as if alive when the wind pressed against castle walls. Servants cursed the icy fingers of air that slipped under door hangings as they tried to sleep. People spoke of chambers where frost formed on interior walls, despite every attempt to seal them. The battle was endless, and victory was only partial. And yet, these strategies mattered. They meant the difference between tolerable sleep and unbearable shivering. They turned vast stone fortresses into somewhat livable spaces. More importantly, they reveal the resilience of medieval households. Without modern insulation, without central heating, without double-glazed windows, they invented a patchwork system that combined architecture, textiles, and human ingenuity. To walk into a medieval bedchamber was to enter a layered world. Wood over stone, tapestry over wood, curtain over bed, blanket over body. Each layer slowed the advance of cold, if only by a fraction. Together, they allowed people to endure. Today we admire tapestries in museums for their artistry, but in their own time they were practical shields. We look at carved wooden paneling and see elegance, but to medieval eyes it was a barrier against drafts. Even the arrangement of rooms tells a story of adaptation. What appears decorative to us was, in truth, insulation born from necessity. The medieval castle was never truly warm, but with enough cloth, wood, and cleverness, it became survivable. And so, when you picture a noble wrapped in furs behind drawn bed curtains, remember that beyond the layers of wool and tapestry, the wind still prowled the corridors. Drafts were always there, waiting to sneak in through the smallest crack. The ingenuity of medieval insulation did not eliminate the cold, but it kept it at bay just long enough for people to sleep, dream, and wake to face another day in their stone fortresses. When night descended on a medieval castle and the fires in the great hall burned low, there was one more weapon people reached for in the battle against the cold, food and drink. Long before the idea of central heating, people understood that warmth could be kindled from within. The body, after all, was itself a furnace, and what you ate and drank could feed its flames. In a world where stone walls turned icy and drafts crept through every seam, a hot meal or a cup of spiced wine was not merely a pleasure, it was survival strategy. Imagine the routine of a winter evening. The household gathers for supper in the great hall. Outside, snow drifts against the walls, but inside the smell of roasted meat fills the air. The cooks have worked tirelessly in the kitchens, where massive fires heat spits heavy with venison, pork, or beef. Thick stews bubble in cauldrons, enriched with barley, root vegetables, and whatever herbs could be gathered from storage. Bread, dense and hearty, is piled on trenchers, ready to soak up broth. As people eat, their bodies respond. Blood rises to the skin, cheeks flush, and the sense of warmth spreads outward from the stomach. This warmth will not last forever, but it provides just enough comfort to face the icy walk back to the chambers. Hot drinks played an equally vital role. Ale was the common drink of the medieval world, but in winter it was often consumed warm. Heated over a fire and sometimes mixed with spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves, it became a soothing remedy against the night chill. Nobles had access to mulled wine, rich with imported spices that not only warmed the body but carried an exotic aura of luxury. A steaming cup of spiced wine before bed was as much a medical treatment as a pleasure. Physicians of the time, guided by humoral theory, advised that warm drinks balanced the cold and damp humors of winter. Whether or not the science was sound, the practice was comforting. There were other tricks as well. Some households used hot stones, heated in the hearth, wrapped in cloth, and carried to bed. But before these were placed under blankets, people often held them briefly in their hands, savoring the momentary relief. Others sipped broth or porridge before climbing into their curtained beds, believing that a warm stomach encouraged deeper sleep. These small rituals carried psychological power. They reassured people that they were not entirely at the mercy of the cold. By eating, drinking, and preparing carefully, they could face the night with greater confidence. Food choices reflected the struggle against cold, too. In winter, households relied on preserved foods, salted meats, smoked fish, dried peas, and turnips stored in cellars. While not luxurious, these foods were dense with calories, and calories meant heat. The body converted fat and protein into fuel to keep shivers at bay. Nobles might enjoy sugar-coated almonds or honey pastries, believing sweet foods produced inner warmth. Peasants had simpler fare but used the same principle: hearty stews, thick porridges, and breads that filled the belly and generated energy for the long night ahead. The cultural imagination wrapped itself around these ideas. Warmth from food and drink became part of the symbolism of hospitality. To offer a guest a hot meal was to shield them from the cold, not just physically, but spiritually. Chronicles describe weary travelers restored by broth and ale, their spirits lifted as much as their bodies warmed. Stories and songs often link hearth, food, and safety, weaving them together into a single image of comfort in a dangerous world. A castle without hot food was seen as failing its duty to protect its household. Yet there were limits, as always. Not everyone in the castle feasted on venison and wine. Servants often made do with thin pottage or coarse bread. Their warmth came less from delicacies and more from quantity, the sheer bulk of whatever they could eat. For many, the evening meal was the last line of defense before crawling onto straw pallets in cold-side chambers. A full belly did not make the draught disappear, but it dulled the sting for a while. Nobles might sip spiced claret in silver goblets, but servants huddled with bowls of porridge, both chasing the same fleeting sense of inner fire. The psychological comfort of these routines should not be underestimated. To sip something hot in the flickering firelight, to feel warmth spread through your chest, was to believe that the night could be endured. Medieval people were as vulnerable to the fears of darkness as we are, perhaps more so. Outside the castle walls, wolves prowled, thieves lurked, and winter storms raged. Inside, the cold pressed against every surface. But at the table, with food in the belly and drink in the hand, the household felt safe. It was a small victory, but one repeated every night, sustaining morale as much as body heat. There were even superstitions tied to this practice. Some believed certain spices carried magical powers to protect against chills. Ginger, for example, was praised not only for flavor, but for its supposed ability to cheer the heart. Warm milk mixed with herbs was given to children to ease them into sleep. Travelers sometimes carried flasks of heated wine as charms against frostbite. These beliefs were not entirely baseless. Many spices did stimulate circulation, and warm liquids certainly eased discomfort. But beyond the practical, they also gave people a sense of control, a way to push back against forces larger than themselves. In the larger rhythm of castle life, the evening meal and drink were the turning point of the day. They marked the shift from public activity in the great hall to private struggle in the chambers. The warmth of food lingered as a final shield against the cold corridors and drafty staircases. It gave people courage to retreat to their beds, to draw their curtains, and to surrender to sleep. Without it, the night would have seemed harsher, the walls more unforgiving. So when we think about how people endured the long winters in stone fortresses, it is not enough to picture blankets and fires. We must also picture the steaming bowls of stew, the mugs of spiced ale, the sweet scent of cloves rising from a cup. We must remember that warmth was not just external, but internal, kindled in the belly and carried into the night. It was fragile, temporary, and easily lost, but it was also enough. For medieval people, every hot meal was a spark of survival, every drink of spiced wine, a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest nights, they had ways to push back against the chill. The medieval world was not only a place of stone walls and smoky fires, but also a world of faith, ritual, and imagination. When night fell and the cold seeped through the castle's defenses, people did not simply rely on blankets or fires. They turned to rituals, prayers, and beliefs to protect themselves from the chill and from the unseen dangers that seemed to ride in with it. Cold was not just a physical condition, it was a spiritual threat, and people developed cultural tools to resist it. Imagine lying in bed as frost forms on the window shutters, the fire dying low, and drafts creeping under the door. You draw the heavy curtains of your bed, but the stone walls groan as the wind presses against them. To the medieval mind, this moment was not just about temperature. The night itself was dangerous. Cold air was associated with sickness, with bad humors that upset the body's balance. It was also thought to be the hour when spirits, demons, and misfortune prowled more freely. To go to sleep unprotected by prayer or ritual was to leave oneself open to forces beyond one's control. This is why evening prayers were so deeply embedded in castle life. Nobles and peasants alike recited prayers before bed, not only to commend their souls to God, but also to ask for protection through the night. The Compline service, held in monasteries at bedtime, was built around the theme of guarding against darkness and cold. Psalms spoke of God as a shelter, a shield, a source of warmth against the chill of both body and soul. These words were not abstract. For people who shivered in damp cells or stone chambers, they carried visceral meaning. Charms and tokens were also common. Some people hung sprigs of herbs like rosemary or rue near their beds, believing these plants repelled not only disease, but also evil spirits. Others carried small amulets or wore crosses as night protection. The belief was that while blankets shielded the body, symbols shielded the soul. Even the placement of the bed could reflect ritual thinking. People avoided sleeping with their feet pointing toward a door, fearing it invited death, just as corpses were carried feet first from chambers. Medical theory of the time also blended into these practices. Physicians working under the framework of humoral theory taught that the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Cold and damp disrupted this balance, leading to illness. To guard against this, people were advised to avoid sleeping on an empty stomach, to keep the head covered, and to drink warming beverages with spices believed to restore inner balance. A cup of mulled wine before bed was not only a comfort, but also a medical prescription in the eyes of the time. Superstition colored these routines as well. Some households believed that keeping a candle burning through the night warded off not only darkness, but also the spirits that traveled with it. Others believed that sudden chills at night were not just drafts, but touches from restless souls. The shiver that woke you in bed might be explained as a ghost brushing past, reminding you of unfinished duties. For this reason, bedtime rituals often included not only prayers but confessions, ensuring that if death came in the night, the soul would not be caught unprepared. Children grew up steeped in these traditions. Before bed, they might be told to recite a prayer to their guardian angel, or to tuck a small charm under the pillow. Stories were told of saints who endured cold with divine aid, their warmth preserved by faith. These tales were not entertainment alone. They were lessons in resilience. They reassured children that, though the night was frightening and cold, spiritual forces stood ready to help them endure. Rituals even extended to the hearth itself. Some people tossed salt into the last embers of the fire, believing it purified the air and warded off misfortune. Others arranged the logs in a particular pattern before leaving the hall, a gesture thought to secure blessings for the household. In castles where fireplaces smoked badly, families sometimes drew protective symbols in the soot to keep evil from entering through the chimney. These acts may seem small, but they reveal how seriously people treated the cold night as both a physical and spiritual frontier. The interplay of fear and faith gave the cold an almost mythic quality. The night frost became more than weather. It was a reminder of mortality, of the thin line between life and death. Illness struck hardest in winter. Children, the elderly, and the sick were most vulnerable. To face this season without rituals was unthinkable. People might not have understood germs, but they understood the fragility of life. Prayer, charms, and symbolic acts gave them a sense of control in a world that was largely uncontrollable. At the same time, these practices bonded households together. Families prayed aloud before bed. Monks chanted Compline in unison, and entire households participated in small acts of protection. It created a sense of shared defense against the night. Just as communal sleeping pooled physical warmth, communal ritual pooled spiritual strength. To light candles, to sprinkle salt, to whisper prayers, these were collective acts of resilience, rehearsed every evening across centuries of castle life. And yet, the rituals did more than ward off fear. They shaped the way people thought about warmth itself. Warmth was not only something you created with fire or fur. It was also a state of blessing, a sign of divine favor, a reward for faithfulness. To wake in the morning unharmed, still breathing, still alive, was experienced as a gift. Every night survived was proof that prayer and ritual had worked. In that sense, belief itself became insulation, a psychological blanket as necessary as any woolen quilt. So when you imagine a medieval chamber on a bitter winter night, do not picture only the physical tools of survival, the tapestries, the beds, the fires. Picture also the whispered prayers, the charms tucked under pillows, the salt tossed into embers, the crosses hung above doors. In those moments, people were not only fighting cold drafts, they were pushing back against the invisible chill of fear. Warmth came from faith as much as from fire. It was fragile, yes, but in a world of stone and shadow, it was enough to carry them through the night. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval life is how flexible people had to be with their living spaces. Castles were not static museums of stone. They were living organisms, and their residents learned to adapt them to the rhythm of the seasons. What worked in July did not work in January, and survival required constant adjustment. The wealthy might seem privileged, surrounded by thick walls and servants, but even they could not escape the power of weather. The way people shifted their rooms and altered their sleeping habits across the year tells us a great deal about how deeply the natural world shaped medieval existence. In summer, castles came alive. Lords and ladies gravitated toward upper floors, lofty chambers with large windows and high ceilings. These spaces were airy, bright, and offered relief from the stifling smoke of the kitchens below. Windows stood open, sometimes draped with thin cloth to keep insects away, and the breeze moved freely. Even the great hall, often draughty and cold in winter, became pleasant in summer, filled with light and air. People slept with lighter coverings, sometimes on pallets moved closer to open windows, enjoying the cool stone that had been their enemy in winter. But as the year turned, these same spaces became traps. By late autumn, the wind that once offered relief became a dagger of frost. High ceilings, once admired for grandeur, now swallowed what little heat the hearth provided. The upper chambers became so frigid that water froze in basins and breath lingered visibly in the air. So households moved, nobles abandoned their lofty summer rooms and retreated to smaller chambers closer to the ground. Sometimes entire families relocated to rooms near the kitchens, where the constant fires gave off ambient warmth through walls and floors. Servants often doubled up in crowded quarters, not for company alone, but to share heat. The castle seemed to shrink in on itself, its residents huddling together in warm pockets, like animals retreating into burrows. This migration was a routine part of life. People expected it, prepared for it, and even planned their architecture around it. Some castles had designated winter chambers and summer chambers, each used at the appropriate time. Winter rooms were small, with low ceilings and fewer windows, easier to heat and easier to insulate with heavy curtains and tapestries. Summer rooms were expansive, with wide views of the landscape and breezes that carried away the smells of sweat and animals. In this way, medieval people built seasonality directly into their homes. Sleeping patterns adapted as well. In summer, the long days and shorter nights meant people rose early and worked late, often sleeping in two shorter stretches rather than one continuous rest. In winter, darkness stretched for 16 hours or more, and people adjusted by spending more time in bed, but in bed did not always mean sleeping. Families used these long nights for quiet conversation, storytelling, or prayer within the curtains of their beds. The warmth of bodies and blankets allowed them to remain in place for hours, dozing in and out of shallow sleep. In many ways, the bed became not just a place of rest, but the center of winter life itself. There is also evidence that people practiced segmented sleep, what historians sometimes call first sleep and second sleep. After going to bed soon after nightfall, they would sleep for several hours, then wake for a period of reflection, conversation, or even work, before returning to sleep until dawn. This rhythm fit naturally with the long winter nights, and it allowed people to use their beds as both refuge and workplace. Within the insulated cocoon of bed curtains, they might say prayers, nurse infants, or even plan the next day's tasks. The cold outside made it impractical to rise fully, so life shifted inward toward the insulated warmth of layered bedding. Seasonal adaptation was not only practical but symbolic. Moving to winter chambers was a public acknowledgement that even nobles bowed to the seasons. It reminded everyone, from the highest lord to the lowest servant, that nature was the true ruler of the castle. Rituals marked these changes. In some households, a formal procession moved bedding, clothing, and tapestries from summer rooms to winter ones, almost like a ceremony of retreat. The reverse took place in spring. when chambers were reopened, cleaned, and refitted with lighter hangings and furnishings. These rhythms gave shape to the year, binding human life to the cycles of nature. Even meals reflected this adaptation. In summer, lighter foods were served, and the great hall echoed with merriment late into the night. In winter, meals were earlier, heavier, and often taken in smaller groups in warmer rooms. After supper, households dispersed quickly, retreating to chambers where warmth could be conserved. A castle that had felt spacious and grand in July became tight and intimate in January, its inhabitants pressed close by necessity. The psychological shift was just as significant. Summer nights allowed freedom, laughter in courtyards, music under the stars. Winter nights demanded introspection and endurance. Families told longer stories by the fire. Monks deepened their prayers, and peasants tightened their bonds of community. Sleep itself became a way of marking time, each night a reminder that another day of winter had passed. People did not expect to be comfortable, they expected to endure, and endurance became its own form of triumph. When we look back at medieval castles today, we often see only their permanence, their stone immobility, but within those walls, life was anything but static. People flowed with the seasons, migrating from hall to chamber, from lofty room to humble corner, adjusting their beds, their meals, their very rhythms of sleep to match the turning of the year. The castle was not a fortress against nature. It was a stage on which humans and nature danced together, sometimes in harmony, often in struggle. So when you imagine a medieval winter, do not picture people stubbornly frozen in place within unchanging stone. Picture instead the constant movement of life inside. Beds dragged closer to fireplaces, curtains doubled over windows, families abandoning upper rooms for the kitchens below, conversations whispered under blankets in the middle of the night. Picture a household that breathed with the seasons, expanding in summer, contracting in winter, shifting like the tide to survive. That was the true rhythm of medieval sleep, an endless adaptation to the power of nature, played out year after year in the cold heart of stone castles. When most of us imagine medieval life, we assume that nobles lived in comfort while peasants suffered in hardship. Castles seem grand, while cottages appear miserable. Yet when it comes to sleep and warmth, the truth is more complicated. In fact, peasants sometimes slept more warmly than nobles, despite their poverty, while the lords of castles often endured nights in chambers that felt more like stone refrigerators than palaces. The contrast between peasant and noble sleep reveals surprising lessons about comfort, survival, and the realities of life in the Middle Ages. Let us begin with the peasants. Their homes were simple, often just one or two rooms, constructed of timber, wattle, and daub, or stone, depending on the region. Roofs were thatched, walls were rough, and smoke from the hearth filled the interior. Yet these cottages had one major advantage over castles: their small size. A single fire, burning in a central hearth, could heat the entire room. The walls might leak drafts, but the space was so compact that heat built up quickly, especially when combined with the body heat of people and animals living inside. Chickens, goats, and sometimes even cows shared the space, their warmth contributing to the microclimate. The air was smoky, the floor dirty, but the overall temperature was often more tolerable than that of a vast, drafty castle chamber. Beds in peasant cottages were crude straw pallets on the floor, or wooden frames stuffed with reeds or hay. They teemed with fleas and lice, and the straw had to be replaced regularly to avoid rot. Yet these beds had the advantage of being low to the ground and close to the hearth. Families often huddled together under rough wool blankets or furs, sharing warmth in a way that nobles would have considered beneath their dignity. Privacy was non-existent, but survival was communal. In the glow of the hearth, with the livestock shifting in the corner and children curled up against their parents, peasants endured the cold together. Now consider the nobles. Their castles were symbols of power, but power did not equal comfort. Bedrooms were enormous, with ceilings so high that fires barely touched the air above. Stone walls, meant to resist siege, radiated cold into the chamber. Windows were wide for light and defense, but they let in drafts even when covered with shutters. A noble might own feather mattresses, fine linen sheets, and furs of fox or sable, but these luxuries were often no match for the sheer size and chill of their surroundings. Fires blazed in their hearths, yet most of the heat vanished up chimneys. Servants carried in braziers and warming pans, but even these provided only temporary relief. It was common for water left in basins to freeze overnight in noble chambers, a misery peasants rarely experienced in their smaller homes. Ironically, the very wealth that allowed nobles to build castles worked against their comfort. Grandeur demanded vast halls, large chambers, and stone construction, all of which made heating nearly impossible. Meanwhile, peasants, crowded into smoky cottages, lived in conditions that were filthy but sometimes warmer. To put it simply, nobles had better bedding, but peasants had better insulation. Of course, there were trade-offs. Peasants endured constant smoke inhalation, coughs, and eye irritation from open hearths with no chimneys. Their straw beds bred vermin, and their rough wool blankets scratched the skin. Illness spread quickly in close quarters. Nobles, while colder, had cleaner linens, softer mattresses, and more layers of fabric to shield them from drafts. Yet even with their furs and feather beds, they often lay awake shivering, the cold gnawing at their bones. Comfort was relative, and survival was always a negotiation. The contrast extended to rituals as well. Peasants went to bed early, soon after sunset. Because candles were costly, they relied on the natural rhythm of day and night, sleeping in long stretches during winter, and rising with the dawn. Nobles, by contrast, stayed awake later, entertaining guests, holding feasts, or conducting business by candlelight. Their nights were filled with music, conversation, and obligations that sometimes stretched long past midnight. Yet when the celebrations ended, they faced the same cold stone that no amount of luxury could fully repel. Travelers often noted these contrasts. Some envoys reported being shocked by the cold of noble chambers, where frost formed on the inside of walls. Others remarked on the warmth of peasant huts, though they found the smoke unbearable. Chroniclers compared the two, sometimes with grudging admiration for the peasants. Practicality. A lord might eat from silver plates and wear velvet robes, but when it came to sleep, a peasant child curled by the hearth might have been more comfortable. This paradox shaped medieval attitudes toward wealth and survival. Nobles flaunted their furs and feather beds because they knew how precarious comfort really was. Bedding was a form of treasure, carefully inventoried and passed down through generations. Peasants, meanwhile, relied on resilience, family bonds, and the heat of crowded living to endure winters that tested everyone equally. The difference was not that one group suffered while the other thrived, but that each endured discomfort in different forms. Perhaps the most important lesson here is that medieval life was not a simple hierarchy of misery at the bottom and ease at the top. Survival in the Middle Ages cut across class lines. Cold did not discriminate. Whether in a smoky cottage or a stone tower, People faced the same biting winds, the same endless drafts, the same long nights. Nobles might have embroidered curtains, peasants rough wool blankets, but both fought the same battle every night: how to create warmth in a world that offered so little of it. So when you picture the contrast between peasant and noble sleep, remember that wealth brought advantages, but not guarantees. A peasant family crowded together under a patchwork quilt beside a smoky hearth might have been warmer than a noble couple lying in a grand chamber lined with furs. The Middle Ages remind us that survival was never just about riches. It was about adaptation, resilience, and the shared human struggle against the cold. When we think about sleep today, we usually imagine it as a time of restoration, of peace, a refuge from the stress of the day. But for people in the Middle Ages, especially those living in stone castles, sleep itself was often a burden. It was not guaranteed comfort, nor was it always refreshing. The conditions under which medieval people laid down at night, the cold, the damp, the noise, the drafts, took a toll not only on their bodies but also on their minds. To understand what it truly meant to sleep in that world, we must step into their shoes and feel both the physical strain and the psychological weight that came with every night. Physically, the problems were relentless. Cold was the most obvious. Even with furs, blankets, and curtains, the body often never felt truly warm. Shivering through the night was common, and the body's constant effort to generate heat drained energy rather than restored it. Many people woke stiff and sore, their muscles tight from curling up against the chill. Joints ached from dampness that seeped into stone walls and floors. Older people especially suffered, with chronic pain in their bones described in documents as winter's grip. Medical texts of the time warned that cold air choked the spirits and caused melancholy humors to rise in the body, reflecting the very real experience of fatigue and illness. Respiratory problems were another constant burden. Fires that offered warmth also filled rooms with smoke, especially in chambers where chimneys drew poorly. People coughed throughout the night, their lungs irritated by soot and ash. In peasant homes, where livestock often shared space with humans, the air was thick with smoke, animal breath, and dampness. Such conditions contributed to chronic coughs, infections, and shortened lives. Sleep, instead of being a time of healing, often made people sicker simply because of the environment in which they rested. The beds themselves brought problems. Feather mattresses were luxurious, but straw pallets were far more common, and they came with vermin. Fleas and lice thrived in the straw, biting through the night and spreading disease. People woke scratching and restless, unable to escape the constant irritation. Even nobles with better bedding were not immune, as furs and cloth also harbored pests. The fight against these tiny intruders was endless, adding another layer of discomfort to every night. Beyond the physical toll was the psychological burden. Nighttime in the Middle Ages was not serene. Darkness was feared. Without modern lighting, the night was truly black, broken only by firelight or the faint glow of the moon through narrow windows. Superstitions about spirits, demons, and witches filled the imagination. Many believed the hours after midnight were the time when evil was most active. To wake shivering in the dark, with the wind howling and tapestry shifting from hidden drafts, was to feel exposed not only to the elements, but to unseen forces. Sleep carried with it a vulnerability that weighed heavily on the mind. Noise also disturbed rest. Castles were never silent. Wooden beams creaked. Rats scurried in the walls. Servants moved through corridors. Guards called to each other on the battlements. In peasant cottages, animals shifted in the straw, children cried, neighbors snored. Privacy was non-existent, and true stillness almost impossible. People became accustomed to a background of sound, but it meant that sleep was often shallow, broken, and restless. Chroniclers wrote of broken nights, and modern historians believe many medieval people lived in a constant state of mild sleep deprivation. Fear of fire added to the burden. Hearths and warming pans were necessary for survival, but they carried the risk of disaster. A stray spark could ignite straw rushes on the floor or bedding in the chamber. Entire households lived with the knowledge that the fire that kept them alive could also consume them. Some slept with one eye open, worried about the glow of embers too close to fabric. In towns, night watchmen patrolled to guard against house fires. But inside castles, the responsibility fell on servants, who often dozed themselves. The unease never fully went away. Psychologically, this nightly struggle left its mark. Sleep was not an escape, but a challenge. People prayed not only for their souls, but for a safe and restful night. To wake alive and relatively healthy was seen as a blessing, not something to take for granted. Parents taught children prayers to recite before sleep, both for spiritual protection and as comfort against the fears of darkness and cold. For monks, whose lives revolved around strict schedules, broken nights were accepted as spiritual discipline. For ordinary people, they were simply reality. The burden of poor sleep spilled into the day. Fatigue was common, especially in winter, when long nights and constant shivering drained energy. Productivity slowed, tempers frayed, and illness spread more easily. Cold, damp, and unrested, people carried the exhaustion of the night into their daily tasks. Yet they endured, adapting through naps, segmented sleep, and the sheer resilience of necessity. Survival required it. And still, despite all this, medieval people found ways to make peace with their nights. They told stories before bed, sang songs, and shared prayers to ease the mind. Families huddled together not only for warmth, but for comfort, drawing strength from closeness. Rituals gave meaning to the nightly struggle, transforming fear into faith. For them, sleep was not the effortless luxury we imagine today. It was an act of endurance, a battle against cold, dark, and dread. So when we look back on medieval sleep, we should not see it as restful in the way we understand it now. It was heavy, burdened, restless, and sometimes frightening. But it was also deeply human. It reveals the resilience of people who managed to carry on day after day, despite conditions that would exhaust us. They accepted the psychological and physical burdens of sleep as part of life, transforming hardship into routine. And in that acceptance, they endured. When we step back and look at the full picture of medieval sleep, what emerges is not only a story of discomfort, but a story of resilience. The people who lived in those cold castles and smoky cottages did not have the comforts we take for granted. No central heating, no insulated windows, no electric lights, no memory foam mattresses. Yet they found ways to endure, to adapt, and to transform hardship into routine. Sleep, far from being an effortless luxury, was an act of survival. And in that act of survival, there are lessons for us today. The first lesson is that comfort is relative. For us, the idea of shivering all night under furs in a stone chamber feels unbearable. But for medieval people, that was simply life. They did not expect warmth in the same way we do. They expected to endure the cold, to layer blankets, to huddle together, to pray for strength. What we might call misery, they called normal. This resilience of expectation is striking. It shows how human beings adapt mentally as much as physically. When you know nothing else, even hardship becomes livable. The second lesson is that survival is communal. Medieval sleep was rarely solitary. People shared beds, chambers, and warmth with family, servants, and sometimes even animals. Privacy was scarce, but companionship was constant. The act of sleeping together was not just about saving heat, it was about strengthening bonds. To drift off hearing the breathing of others was reassurance against the fears of darkness and spirits. It reminded people that they were not alone. In a world where death and disease were constant, that sense of community was vital. Today we often isolate ourselves in private bedrooms, yet the medieval model shows the power of closeness in times of hardship. The third lesson is ingenuity. Faced with freezing drafts and unyielding stone, people invented a layered system of defenses, tapestries hung on walls, curtains around beds, shutters lined with cloth or horn, straw pressed into cracks, rushes strewn across floors. They used what they had: wood, wool, fur, straw, herbs, and built microclimates inside their homes. The canopy bed was not just decoration, it was technology, a carefully engineered survival pod. The feather mattress, the fur quilt, the warming pan, all were tools in the nightly battle. Ingenuity does not always look like grand inventions. Sometimes it is a collection of small, clever solutions to everyday problems. The fourth lesson is ritual. Medieval people gave meaning to their struggle through prayer and belief. They did not simply crawl into bed and hope for the best. They recited prayers, lit candles, hung charms, and trusted in symbols to guard them through the night. Whether or not these rituals truly kept illness and spirits away, they offered psychological comfort. They created a sense of protection when the world outside felt uncontrollable. In this way, faith itself became insulation, a spiritual blanket layered over the body's defenses. The fifth lesson is humility before nature. Castles may have towered over landscapes, but their lords could not command the seasons. Wealth brought furs and feather beds, yet nobles still lay awake shivering, while peasants, huddled in smoky cottages, sometimes slept warmer. This irony reveals the limits of power. The cold humbled everyone. No matter how high their rank, people had to bow to the authority of winter. This recognition shaped medieval rhythms, seasonal migrations within castles, segmented sleep patterns, feasts timed around harvests and stores, life bent to nature's cycle, not the other way around. The sixth lesson is endurance. Night after night, year after year, people endured conditions that would break many of us. They rose in the morning after restless sleep, stiff and coughing, and went about their tasks regardless. They did not have the option to complain, to demand comfort, or to escape their reality. Endurance became second nature, woven into their character. This endurance carried them through not only cold nights but also plagues, famines, and wars. It is part of why their stories still resonate. They remind us of how strong human beings can be when there is no alternative but to survive. Finally, the greatest lesson is gratitude. To us, medieval sleep is a tale of hardship. To them, waking each morning was a small miracle. To survive another night, to see the dawn, to feel the weak warmth of the sun after hours of cold, that was a gift. Gratitude was not an abstract concept, but a lived reality. Every prayer of thanks in the morning was sincere. Every sigh of relief when the fire caught and the day began was heartfelt. They lived in constant awareness of life's fragility, and that awareness gave even small comforts deep meaning. When we compare their world to ours, we see how dramatically expectations have shifted. We adjust thermostats with a button, close double-glazed windows, and slide under soft duvets without a thought. We demand comfort as a right, but the medieval struggle with sleep reminds us that comfort is not guaranteed, that survival itself is extraordinary, and that resilience is humanity's greatest strength. Their lives were harder, yes, but in that hardship they discovered reserves of adaptability and endurance that remain inspiring. So the next time you lie in a warm bed, think of the noble shivering in a vast stone chamber, the peasant huddled with children beside a smoky hearth, the monk chanting prayers in a drafty dormitory. Think of the ingenuity of tapestries, the closeness of communal sleep, the faith that turned fear into courage. Their nights were long, their sleep was burdened, but they endured. And from their endurance comes a timeless lesson that even in the coldest, darkest places, humanity finds a way not only to survive, but to carry on with hope, ritual, and resilience. And so, when we look back at the way people slept in the Middle Ages, we see not only the hardships of cold stone, smoky hearths, and restless nights, but also the ingenuity, community, and resilience that allowed them to endure. Castles may have been freezing fortresses, but within those walls, people found ways to adapt to layering beds with furs, gathering in great halls, sharing warmth with family and servants, relying on rituals and faith to carry them through the night. Their struggle reminds us that human beings have always faced challenges, and that survival often depends not on comfort, but on creativity and togetherness. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten world of medieval sleep. If you enjoyed exploring this hidden side of history, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss future stories. Until next time, sleep well and remember, even the coldest nights can be endured when warmth is shared.